So, if you're a nerd and you're on the internet, you've probably at least heard of the proposed new open gaming license for D&D and the absolute tidal wave of controversy that's been unleashed in the past couple weeks. But maybe you haven't heard the true root cause of it all. Lucky for you, I'm here to explain why this disaster is about much more than one bad decision, or a few foolish executives, or even one greedy bastard of a corporation, but actually points to the rotten core of capitalism itself, and possibly even to some ways we might collectively resist and transform this oppressive system. Welcome to the Professor Polymorph Show, Unplugged. So class, let's jump right into the communist propaganda. First, a tiny bit of history and context. Wizards of the Coast, the company that currently owns Dungeons & Dragons, created the Open Gaming License in 2000. Similar to open source software, the OGL made it possible for others to use the intellectual property related to Dungeons & Dragons for their own purposes. Keep in mind, class, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a shape-shifting mutant professor, and this is a YouTube video, not legal advice. So while it certainly wasn't perfect, the Open Gaming License 1.0a allowed for a flourishing of imagination and culture. We're talking alternative game systems, setting books, third-party supplements for Dungeons & Dragons, fan art, silly nerd bands, and wildly popular actual play podcasts and videos. All of this helped contribute to the enormous cultural influence of Dungeons & Dragons, and generations of nerds were shocked that somehow their weirdo hobby had become kind of cool and trendy? Or was that just me? Fast forward to January 5th of this year, when a draft of a new version of the Open Gaming License was leaked. This new version, OGL 1.1, was, much shittier. Some of the new and improved features included Wizards of the Coast / Hasbro demanding royalties from companies making above a certain threshold, a clause which allowed them to change the license with just 30 days notice, and another clause which seemed to indicate that Wizards would be able to use content from both fan-made and third-party company-made works in their own products. Nice custom world you've built there, Dungeon Master. Mind if a huge billion-dollar corporation seizes your realm to profit off of it? But the thing that has been the most upsetting to both fans and third-party companies was the deauthorization of the previous OGL 1.0a. This scummy act by Wizards threatens, and has maybe already destroyed, that vibrant ecosystem of openly shared culture and nerdy fun. It's a lot like the enclosure acts that were passed in England in the 18th and 19th centuries. Before this, most farming in England happened through the open field system, which was based on common land that many people had rights to, also known as the commons. Now, this wasn't some utopian system. Most farmers were still economically exploited by the aristocrats and landowners. But the Enclosure Act made things much worse, concentrating even more wealth and power in even fewer hands. In the words of good old Karl Marx himself, the parliamentary form of the robbery is that of acts for enclosure of commons. In other words, decrees by which the landlords grant themselves the people's land as private property. By seizing common land and charging rent for it, landlords were creating a system where they could endlessly profit without contributing anything to society. This is called rent-seeking, or rentier capitalism. Sounds kind of like demanding royalties so you can make money from other people's books because you own the intellectual property of Dungeons & Dragons, even though you didn't create D&D, and even though D&D itself is a hodgepodge of various fantasy tropes, adventure novels, and modern reimaginings of ancient folklore and mythology. This brings us to some deeper questions. Why should Wizards of the Coast own Dungeons & Dragons? Why should Hasbro own Dungeons & Dragons? Why should anyone own Dungeons & Dragons? These are similar to questions like, why should anyone own Cinderella or Robin Hood? These characters, these worlds and stories are part of a shared cultural inheritance, part of our collective history and legacy. In other words, part of a commons. This is the philosophy behind open licensing systems like Creative Commons. Now, I think you could make a reasonable argument that a writer or artist ought to have some control over their creations, like the moral rights that ensure a creator is properly attributed or can decide when and how a work is displayed, or can prevent people from altering the work. I might have some quibbles with this, but can also totally understand this perspective. But why should control over a creative work be something that can be bought and sold? Why should those moral rights be transferred to someone who had nothing to do with envisioning and making the painting or the novel or, in this case, the fantasy setting and game system? And especially to someone who has no or very little connection with the culture and community that's intertwined with the game, or someone who isn't even a person but is a legal fiction, i.e. a corporation. So these are not just ethical questions, but practical questions. Like, even if you don't give two kobold poops about the moral implications of copyright law, you might care about a greedy, soulless corporation demolishing a beloved game and screwing over a bunch of smaller companies, freelancers, and fans. In other words, a system like capitalism that hands over control to whoever can spend the most money to buy and control pieces of our cultural commons is a bad idea. Not just because it's evil, but because it's going to result in harmful and stupid decisions, unfun games, and terrible art, books, and movies. Let's do a quick thought experiment. Imagine that rather than Dungeons & Dragons being owned by a typical corporation like Hasbro, which is run by a CEO and a board of directors and obligated to provide ever-increasing profits to stockholders, none of whom might actually care at all about the game or the fans except as a source of income. Instead of all that, imagine that management of D&D was entrusted to a worker-owned cooperative, where the writers, designers, and artists would collectively decide what happens with the game. Or imagine that a broader pool of interested parties, say any player who wanted to participate, would decide which direction to take the game using direct democracy. Or imagine some kind of hybrid between the two, where the gaming community would elect a smaller group of individuals to steer the direction of the game, with the liquid democracy option of immediately selecting new representatives if they made unpopular or dangerous decisions. Or maybe the game is just part of the Creative Commons and anyone can do what they will with it. Do you think any of these democratically controlled open systems would make worse decisions than Hasbro just has? Or maybe they might even make better decisions. This thought experiment highlights one of the most absurd and harmful aspects of capitalism, the lack of economic democracy and the tyranny of bosses. I mean, it's kind of strange, isn't it? Supposedly, the US values democracy so intensely that we've been willing to go to war over it multiple times. And yet it's somehow not just tolerated, but celebrated for CEOs to act like kings and the fiefdoms of their companies, for bosses to have the unilateral power of dictators. Sounds like a huge contradiction to me, to toss in another Marxist term. To me, this whole kerfluffle demonstrates how dangerous and destructive capitalism is. Beyond the realm of tabletop games even, capitalism is destroying the commons all over the place, like a rampaging horde of zombies, plundering and attacking the rights of workers, the capacity of people to afford food and housing, the right for indigenous peoples to live in their traditional land-based ways, and even the health of the wild ecosystems we all depend on. This is all an indicator that we probably need to expand democracy into the realms of finance and the structure of businesses, and not to look more at the leftist vision for things like worker cooperatives, participatory economics, direct democracy, worker and consumer councils, and legal and cultural protection for the commons. And apparently Wizards of the Coast agrees with me, because since I wrote the previous part of the script, they have announced a new version of the OGL, which releases some of the core rules of Dungeons & Dragons under a Creative Commons license. What the fork? How did Wizards of the Coast transform from a greedy, ruthless corporation willing to upend 20 years of goodwill and trust to turn a quick buck into a caring, progressive steward and protector of the community in just 2 weeks? Well, the massive backlash might have had something to do with it. Like maybe the strength of the community response pushed Wizards/Hasbro to walk back some of the worst aspects, including the demands for royalties. Here are some of the things that put pressure on Wizards to change their tune. A flood of bad publicity, including many scathing YouTube videos. An organized campaign to cancel D&D Beyond subscriptions, which worked so well it caused the website to crash. The creation of an alternate gaming license, the Open RPG Creative License, also known as ORC, which to date over 1,500 publishers have signed on to. This is pretty exciting to me. The wave of cancellations can be understood as a boycott, but it can also be understood as a consumer strike, and maybe even as a chance for the birth of a consumer union, a true players guild, or even a league of adventurers. Similarly, the creation of the ORC license is an attempt to claim another commons, a separate sphere outside of Hasbro's control. These things underline that Wizards does not hold all the cards, that we have power, especially when we act collectively. It's beautiful and moving to see so many players and fans acting in solidarity with smaller companies, designers, and artists. Which brings me to a quick note. I don't think being against capitalism means one has to mindlessly be equally opposed to all companies and all businesses. Just as anarchists and socialists still need to make money to survive in the current system, the people who make role-playing games do too. So my plan is to both advocate for deeper, radical changes and also to support the smaller companies, most of whom have much closer ties to the community and who are acting with much more integrity, as the org license demonstrates. So now back to the OGL 1.2. While there are some improvements, there are still many problems with this new version. At first glance, Wizards releasing some of the core rules for D&D under a Creative Commons license is pretty surprising, and seems like a very good thing. But it might not really be all that amazing, for a couple reasons. The first is that several lawyers, including the Legal Eagle, have commented that the rules of a game are not something that can be copyrighted. So this gift isn't something that Wizards can even give away because they don't actually have it in the first place. The second is that Wizards did not release some of the most iconic and key aspects of the D&D rules, including specific spells like Magic Missile, and the rules around classes, aka fighters, wizards, rogues, druids, etc., under this Creative Commons license. And some of the terms of the OGL 1.2 are still pretty bad. Wizards is still claiming they can deauthorize the previous OGL 1.0a, the one from 20 years ago, and doing that will still shatter the foundation of that thriving nerdy commons that has allowed so much imagination to flourish. And here's another part that really rubs me the wrong way. Section 6.f. You will not include content in your licensed works that is harmful, discriminatory, illegal, obscene, or harassing, or engage in conduct that is harmful, discriminatory, illegal, obscene, or harassing. We have the sole right to decide what conduct or content is hateful, and you covenant that you will not contest any such determination via any suit or other legal action. Forgive me if I don't trust Hasbro to wield this power in a fair and just manner. Partially because this section means that Hasbro can cancel your license, that is your capacity to use, make, and share D&D related works, just by asserting that you've done something harmful, and only they can decide what counts as harmful. This is a loophole so wide you could fly a dragon through it. So Hasbro isn't really treating the shared inheritance of D&D as a commons, but as a walled garden, or even as a company town. This section also gives us Hasbro's answer as to why they should own and control D&D, because they have to prevent people from making oppressive content. But there's a few problems with this nakedly cynical, woke, capitalist nonsense. First, why should anyone trust Hasbro's capacity to truly sort out oppressive content? They have released and published plenty of oppressive content, both through the decades and even quite recently. Similarly, the word obscenity is troubling because accusations of obscenity are often used to censor queer creative works. This has also happened recently with queer Dungeons and Dragons content being removed. Secondly, it's a little hard for me to believe that social justice is Hasbro's true motivation for this seizure of power, and that they're not just using that as a fig leaf for their true financial motivations. Finally, if maintaining creative control is so important, why are they releasing any of the rules of D&D under Creative Commons license? It just doesn't make sense and doesn't add up, especially in the wake of the first leaked OGL. So while I do think it's important to acknowledge that the OGL 1.2 is a partial victory and a testament to our collective power, I don't think it's nearly good enough. I stand with both the people who are choosing to step away from D&D and also the people who are continuing to put pressure on Hasbro to truly honor and protect the commons. Now, of course, I think ultimately we need to step away from capitalism entirely and into a new socialist or anarchist or something we don't yet have a name for system. And of course, capitalism is much bigger than this one company and this one game, and even the entire field of tabletop role-playing games, which is a drop in the bucket of the world economy. But if we can learn how to stand up to corporations in this one realm, if we can figure out how to work together to protect the commons and organize ourselves to reclaim power and share resources, well, maybe we can level up and apply what we learned to bigger and badder monsters. So class, remember, no matter how much Wizards of the Coast wants to lure or force you into their virtual walled garden so they can collect those subscription coins from you every month, that you always have some power, some existential choice that they can't take away from you. Remember that it's our friendships and shared imagination that actually make the game run. Remember that when we band together in solidarity with all of our varying races and classes and skills and difficulties, we can defeat the Lich King. We can steal the treasure from his dungeon tomb, where it's stored up in huge piles gathering dust, and instead distribute it to all who need it and use it to build a lush, green, beautiful world where dreams and play and joy are freely shared and held in common. Thanks for watching. This is Professor Polymorph. Let me know in the comments what you think about Wizards of the Coast, intellectual property, capitalism, socialism, anything you want. Okay, and because you've made it to the end, here's a special bonus. This is a poem that was written in protest of one of the original Enclosure Acts in England. They hang the man and flog the woman who steals the goose from off the common, yet let the greater villain loose that steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine who take the things that are yours and mine. The poor and wretched don't escape if they conspire the law to break. This must be so, but they endure, those who conspire to make the law. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack till they go and steal it back.